Okay. So I just want to test that you can, I'm just going to do a little test that I can be heard. Okay, great. So one moment. Hi. So welcome to our seminar. I just want to say welcome and thank you for attending the seminar for evaluators and providers on how to secure and advocate for increased services, increased special education services during COVID. And Jennifer Ratcliff is going to be joining us as well. We're just trying to clean up some technical issues. Okay, great. And so my name is Cynthia Lane. I'm a special education attorney.
And I'm Jennifer Ratcliff. I'm also a special education attorney. And we are going to turn off our video for most of this. We wanted to say hi, but the internet is like a little unstable these days with everyone on their devices. So we don't want you to miss the important information. So we're going to turn off the video and just keep talking.
All right. So we were motivated to present this seminar as a result of a number of parents we have spoken with about how their children are struggling and regressing with remote and blended learning. And since evaluators and providers are key to securing increased services, we wanted to share with you information about the process and our experience that could help you advocate for increased services for the students that you're working with. And when we talk about increased services, we mean more supportive programs as well as related services like speech, OT, PT, counseling, and SETS. So let's go over the goals for the seminar. During the seminar, we will discuss crafting strong report recommendations to address issues specific to COVID. We're also going to provide tips for advocating during an IEP meeting for increased services. We're going to discuss COVID-specific issues that we've come across in our practice. And given the education landscape is constantly changing, we want to share information about issues that we see developing, but also hear from you about issues that you're encountering. So we'll be taking questions at the end of the seminar, but we also hope that you'll share any instances or experiences that you would like to share with the group. So before we start our seminar, we wanted to highlight how your role is critical to the IEP process. To provide some context and background, under the law, if a child with a disability is struggling to function in school academically, socially, and emotionally, it's the DOE's obligation to evaluate the student and provide special education services, provides the services the student requires. While the DOE has this affirmative duty to provide these services, the process generally starts with the parent submitting a request for an IEP meeting for increased services. The DOE is obligated to evaluate the student. However, the parent, as you know, can provide their own evaluations from private evaluators, their reports, and letters of support from their providers to be considered by the IEP team. Currently, IEP teams are more than willing to rely on private evaluations instead of conducting DOE evaluations for safety reasons. This is a real benefit for the parent because usually most often the private provider's evaluation is the strongest evaluation. Given the IEP is supposed to be developed based on the data in front of the CSE or the IEP team at the time of the meeting, private evaluators and providers play a critical role in the IEP meeting and at hearing. First, you are the parent's expert at the meeting. The DOE psychologists and teachers and providers are considered to be the DOE's experts. Their primary goal tends to be to provide the least amount of support possible for the student, usually describing it as the least restrictive environment. But you, with your credentials, your experience, your firsthand knowledge of the student, are in the position to advocate for what you believe the student requires if the DOE fails to offer sufficient support. Second, there are many times where the members of an IEP team from the DOE have never evaluated the student or even met the student. So you, with your firsthand knowledge of the student, either through an evaluation or providing them services, carry significant weight when you provide your opinion and recommendation about what the child requires. Third, if you have observed DOE classes and programs, including observing them remotely from your own home currently, that knowledge also gives your opinions and recommendations significant weight when making those recommendations or objecting to a DOE program. Lastly, hearing officers rely on your opinion when they issue their decisions and make awards. Just as an example, there's a case where an IEP team rejected a parent evaluator's opinion that the student required ABA services. The parent's evaluator had actually evaluated the student. However, the IEP team's rejection was deemed improper because the court found that none of the participants in the IEP team or the IEP meeting from the DOE had actually observed the student, evaluated the student, or met the student. In addition, the court found that the DOE could not reject the recommendation by a private evaluator without any data to contradict the private evaluator's data and recommendation. So you can see where your evaluations and recommendations can carry the day for a student at a hearing. So this is an overview of the topics that we're going to cover in this webinar. We're going to discuss the issues around remote testing during this time, report recommendations for increased services and tips for making strong recommendations. We're going to discuss a general overview of the menu of DOE programs so that you can be familiar with the offerings of these programs and assess whether they're appropriate during a meeting. We're going to offer tips for advocating in an IEP meeting, and we're also going to walk you through making a case for a recommendation of a deferral to CBST for a non-public school or a private school recommendation when the DOE cannot offer an appropriate recommendation. So Jennifer is now going to go through the DOE or remote testing for you.
Thanks, Cynthia. So we are getting this question a lot, whether or not remote testing will be considered valid or whether or not it may cause issues down the line in a case. And we feel the first and most important rule when deciding if you're going to test remotely is to look at the testing protocols and to see if the remote testing could in any way invalidate the results. I know that the testing companies for a few tests already have said that remotely the results would not be valid. But by and large, I'm hearing from all of you that that most testing can be done remotely. And Cynthia and I both feel that if that's the case, and certainly safety is a factor and the need to evaluate students without delay is a factor, that you should go ahead and use remote testing as long as you follow the protocols of the testing and you feel that you can get a valid result. If the validity is compromised in any way, you should note that in your report. So just in the same way that you may note that the child was having a bad day, maybe they were sick, maybe they were changing medications, and that might have skewed the results. You want to note any challenges that came up because of the remote testing in the report itself. Also, this is another question I'm getting a lot. My understanding, and I spoke to at least 2 DOE personnel about this, is that the DOE is doing remote and in-person testing. So it would be hard for them to argue that your tests aren't valid if they're also doing remote testing. I think they are avoiding doing a lot of testing in general right now, for what it's worth, but they are doing both, and they told me that it really depends on the circumstances and how comfortable the family is, and if the family's in a red zone, etc. But they are doing both. They will make accommodations for in-person testing if necessary, and they're also working with some outside contractors who are willing to do it in person. So they're really also doing this all on a case-by-case basis, as we recommend you do. I think one of the concerns is that your testing will not be taken seriously if it's done remotely. We just want to tell you that challenges to remote testing or any testing should be raised by the DOE at the IEP meeting. They shouldn't be raising those issues at a hearing, certainly not years down the line. If you come to a meeting and they're looking at your testing results or several assessments and they have a problem with the remote testing, that should be raised at that time. And the DOE has the ultimate responsibility to conduct further testing. They have the burden of testing the student, of assessing every student with a disability in all areas of disability, not you. So they would then, and if they felt that one of your tests was compromised, they would then have to conduct testing of their own at that point. So it would be really hard for them to come back later. I'm sure they will try to do it at some point, but to come back later at a hearing and say there were all these issues that they hadn't raised previously. Now, Cynthia and I have not seen any negative effects of remote testing on cases, but it is very early. I've gone to hearing on very few cases that involve these issues, really. So we'll see as time goes on, but we feel very strongly that as long as you use your good discretion and you're all very capable and top of your field, that remote testing should continue. And it's certainly preferable to a child waiting to be tested. None of us know how long COVID is going to last, obviously. We do feel that hearing officers understand the bind that everyone's in. And as long as you can explain your reasoning to the hearing officer and you feel that the results of your test stand up, we see no reason why a reasonable hearing officer, and most of them are reasonable, wouldn't accept your evaluation. So now Cynthia is going to talk more specifically with you about the recommendations in your reports.
Thank you. So with regard to report recommendations, as we mentioned earlier, the IEP team, the CSC or the SBSD, is supposed to make its decision based on the data in front of it at the meeting. We advise parents to obtain private evaluations because they're more comprehensive than the DOE evaluations, and because the private evaluators actually make recommendations, whereas the DOE typically does not. So the report in your recommendations are very important. Given the pandemic, we believe it's important when writing a recommendation for a new evaluation that those reports provide specific recommendations for remote learning and in-person learning. Last year, when reports were being written and meetings were being held, it was uncertain if students would be back in school by now, and if they were, what the classroom instruction was going to look like. This year, there's more information about the programs, but it's uncertain when the students will return to a normal in-school instruction. It is possible over the course of the next year that the student could be in a remote program as part of the year, and then at some point, hopefully, return to normal in-classroom instruction. So to address the period in flux, it's important to add to reports sections that address services and include services you believe the student requires while receiving remote instruction, blended instruction, and traditional instruction. During this year, many students' needs have increased as a result of the change in their program to remote and blended learning, which I'm sure you've probably encountered so far. Parents could submit a request for an IEP meeting reconvene to address the need for increased services to address the student's increased needs or regression. They don't have to wait for the annual review to get increased services. When the parents request increased services, the evaluator can provide an addendum to a prior report based on parent interviews, teacher interviews, and additional evaluative data. The CSE is obligated to consider or hold a meeting to consider that new information. The addendum can include recommendations that address the student's needs and increased needs during remote learning and blended learning. So some ideas for recommendations would be to include a mandate for small group instruction for specific core subjects, limiting the number of students that can be in a group. To recommend one-to-one support for specific periods of time and durations, and weekly check-ins. The recommendation can also include strategies and support for the parent. For example, FBAs that can be provided or implemented at home if the parent is able to during remote learning. You can recommend any of the services the child requires to function academically, socially, and emotionally. So some other additional tips with regard to writing strong report recommendations. The first one being is to avoid Department of Education labels for programs, but instead provide descriptions of the program. So for example, to avoid recommending an ICT class in a report. The reason why is often, for example, a student's recommended an ICT class if they have they're average to above average cognitive ability, but they have attentional issues, maybe are easily distracted, but they require more support. And the ICT class might make sense because it's going to have an additional special education teacher to provide additional support. However, those classes can be from 32 to 33 students, and 12 of those students with similar needs. During the remote programs, those compilations can be different, but it varies from school to school. There's some schools that have general education classes with up to 60 students and one teacher, or their ICT classes are being taught by a special education teacher part of the time and a general education teacher other times. So that label ICT, it's incredibly vague, and it's being interpreted in all sorts of ways by the DOE at this time. So it's better to instead include a specific instruction. So instead of recommending an ICT class, to make a recommendation for a small integrated class with no more than X number of students, with a low student-teacher ratio, with similarly functioning peers, maybe in a language-based program with multisensory learnings, if the child needs therapeutic support to specify that. If they require executive functioning support, to specify that as well. And also include that the student should not be placed in a program with students with severe behavioral issues or substantial behavioral issues. If the child requires certain reading programs, to include that. So we really recommend avoiding DOE descriptions or DOE labels, and instead really describing the program that you're envisioning that student requires. The thing to keep in mind is that if you recommend an ICT class and the IEP team recommends that ICT class, they will then use that as proof later at a hearing that they basically adopted what the evaluator recommended, even though you weren't actually intending it to mean that they would be in a class up to 33 students. So that's just some strong recommendation that we would make. Next, we'd also just highlight some of the terminology that's most beneficial. We recommend that you use the term "it requires" or "needs" as opposed to "benefits from." So for example, the student requires a small classroom with a low student-teacher ratio as opposed to "benefits from." I've often heard district representatives say everybody benefits from a small classroom. And so it's really important that the report is very explicit that the student requires it. Otherwise, the DOE simply interprets that if you say benefits from, that they interpret that as just optional. Also, we just want to remind you that you're not limited to the recommendations to recommend DOE programs and services. You can recommend the program that you think the student requires. The worst thing the CSE can do is say no, but at the end of the day, you've made the case in your report that that's what the student requires. And lastly, that you don't want to include a recommendation for a specific school. For example, you would include a recommendation for maybe Gateway or the Sterling School. But instead, what you can do is you can describe the characteristics of that school. So you can recommend a program that includes a small school with small class sizes where all of the core subjects are taught in small group instruction. It's multisensory learning. You can describe the specific characteristics of that school that you're considering or that you think would be an appropriate program and what makes it appropriate program for them, as opposed to naming that particular school in your recommendation. So now Jennifer is going to go through the DOE menu of public school options so that you can be familiar with them and object to them if necessary. Oh, it looks like Jennifer might be having a little bit of trouble. If you can just hold on for 1 second.
Really supposed to be.
Oh, there we go. Jennifer, I can't hear you speaking.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
I can. There you go.
Oh, sorry. So we're going to go through the DOE's menu of options a bit, and I'm going to go through them in terms of how they are, pre-COVID and post-COVID. We'll talk a bit more about the problems that have been occurring during COVID, but this is the traditionally how these options are. So the least restrictive program for kids with an IEP is a gen ed recommendation with support of either sets or related services or both. And I think the important thing to understand here is that a lot of people feel students need remediation or tutoring or some type of a literacy program. I have a lot of kids with that recommendation who are in public school right now. But SETS is a very specific thing. It's more models of resource room type of a program. It's pull out, it's in a group. The kids may not be working on the same thing. And while it's a special ed teacher running the program, it may not be, it's not a one-on-one type thing. So if you are envisioning a child needing, like, for instance, a one-on-one Orton Gillingham reading remediation, you really should specify that, because that's not SETS. So you don't want the DOE to think that something like SETS would work when really what the child needs is an intense one-on-one program in addition to their regular ELA class, because again, SETS is a pull-out. So they'll pull them out of their group class into this smaller kind of setting with a bunch of kids that aren't necessarily working on the same thing. Next on the list is ICT, integrated co-teaching, and Cynthia talked about that a lot, but things to note about ICT is they tend to be larger than what most people think. And also they don't always go throughout the entire day. So, while it may be fine and in fact preferable that this child is mainstreaming for lunch or recess, what I think a lot of people don't realize is sometimes they want to mainstream the child for even something like social studies or science. I've seen that a lot. So you really want to specify, that this child needs special ed support for all their academic classes or all their classes. And while it's great to have mainstreaming peers, that be done at the appropriate time and that they have the right supports the rest of the day. So just something to keep in mind, because an ICT recommendation doesn't necessarily mean they're with that same cohort and teachers all day long. And again, keep in mind those classes can be quite large, especially right now in the remote, during the remote days. Then we have the self-contained classes. So that's a 12-1-1, 12-1, or a 15-1 in a community school, and then also within District 75, which is completely special education. We have the 12-1-1, 12-1-4, 8-1-1, and 6-1-1. And what's important to note about these classes is, first of all, the DOE tends to pigeonhole certain types of students into certain classes. So if you're behavioral, they tend to put you in the 8-1-1. If you're physically handicapped as well as cognitively impaired, they'll tend to put you in the 12-1-4. If you're severely autistic, it's a 6-1-1. So they very much have a theme. While, for instance, you may go to a school like, say, Mary McDowell, and you see kids in 6-kid classes all the time, and those kids are actually pretty high functioning. In the DOE, a 6-1-1, would never be recommended for a child at that level. So what I really want to emphasize is these classes, the smaller they get, the more, the lower functioning they are really, in terms of peers. So when you're making the recommendation for class size, as Cynthia laid out, you really want to also talk about the peers and the curriculum and the methodologies that the child needs as well, because you're not going, this is often the problem really, is that you want a small class, but then they're not peers at the proper level. So you really, really want to keep in mind the fact that that there is a correlation there, and that only the most severely impaired students are in the smaller classes. So you have to keep that in mind. Finally, there's the option to defer the case to CBST for placement in a New York State approved school, non-public school, as opposed to a private school. The DOE often tries to peg this as extremely restrictive option, but they do that because they don't. These are completely self-contained schools, so there's no gen ed students. However, you'd be hard pressed to find a child in 6-1-1 who's getting any mainstream interaction with mainstream peers. So they tend to do that, but it's a bit misleading. And I think also we have to keep in mind that, for instance, Churchill was an approved school up until just this past September. And those kids are considered really pretty high functioning. So it's really not restrictive in the way that the DOE points it out, describes it. And in a lot of cases, this may be your best option because these other options may not work so well for the student, and they may need something outside of the public options. We're going to talk a bit about that later on in terms of how to advocate for that at the meeting, but that is another option. So what's on everyone's mind right now? There have been a lot of changes to these programs during COVID. I think a lot of people have seen in the news that while classes in person might be small, some of the remote classes have really ballooned to large numbers. Also, there's teachers being shuffled around a lot, and there may be teachers assigned to classes with little to no special education experience, or no experience in that subject, or a teacher that typically teaches a non-academic class, teaching academic classes. I have even personal anecdotes of this happening to friends who are feeling very uncomfortable being placed in these classes. Another issue that we're seeing is ICT classes with only one teacher, as opposed to the two that are mandated. And oftentimes it's the special ed teacher that's not there. So you may think the child's getting ICT, but in fact, they're really only getting taught by a gen ed teacher, which I don't have to say is extremely problematic. So again, the big takeaway here is to describe the class and not just to name the class. And that is more important than ever during COVID, because these classes are looking very, very different. And to describe the class in terms of what the child needs in school and what they'll need on their remote days. So, you want to keep in mind that these things are happening, and really, really, really describe what the child needs in both instances, so that the DOE can't claim that what they've given under the circumstances of COVID is good enough for that child. So now we're going to talk to you a bit about advocating at an IEP meeting.
So many parents who have been on the fence previously about considering a private school are finding that the current circumstances are revealing that their child needs cannot be met in a community school. And they are considering DOE-approved private schools and non-approved private schools at this point. The strategies for advocating in an IEP meeting for increased services do not really change during COVID. But in these cases, the goal at the meeting is for the IEP team to recommend a deferral to CBST. And that CBST stands for the Central Base Support Team. And it's a deferral for a state-approved non-public school. This recommendation serves two purposes. First, if the parents recommended or the students recommended for a state-approved non-public school, then it will be funded entirely by the DOE automatically. Secondly, if the student's program is deferred but they can't find a placement, it makes the case much easier for the attorney to get funding for a non-approved private school. So typically that's the goal that we're pushing for in an IEP meeting. And really it's based on the fact that the CSE is not able, or the IEP team is not able to recommend an appropriate community school program for the student. So just walking you through a typical situation that comes up often. First, you would have a private neuropsychological report that recommends a full-time program with a small class size with a low student-teacher ratio, where the student is recommended to be placed with similarly functioning peers in the average to above average range, and that the recommendation states that the student should not be placed with students with significant behavior issues. Now, in this type of case, the DOE or the IEP team would likely recommend an ICT class because they would be focusing on the average to above average cognitive abilities. However, in a traditional ICT class, like we discussed, and in a remote class, those classes can have up to 33 students. So it would not meet the recommendation and the requirement that the students placed in a small class size with a low student-teacher ratio and should be taught by a special education teacher. During the meeting, you as the evaluator at this time could voice your objection to such a recommendation based on your knowledge of that type of program, arguing that it's too large and it does not offer sufficient support. Sometimes the CSE will agree or indicate that they do acknowledge that it's not an appropriate fit or a perfect fit, or there's some deficiencies in that recommendation. So the CSE will then start to look at the next program, the more supported program of a 12-1. However, the problem with that program is that that program's typically for students with lower cognitive functioning. So even though it does check the box for a small class size and a special education teacher, it's typically for students with lower cognitive functioning. So that's not appropriate, obviously, because the student would not be placed with similarly cognitive peers or peers functioning at similarly cognitive levels and would not be challenged. Sometimes this DOE will continue to work through the continuum and talk about the 12-1-1 not being appropriate because typically those programs are for students with lower cognitive functionings who also have behavioral issues that they're struggling with. And so that would not be appropriate for this child either. So it's generally at this point that the team either just makes a recommendation for the ICT program or the 12-1, or they try to get the evaluator and the parent to choose one of their options. Recognizing what the deficiencies are with each program, recognizing that each one is really not an appropriate fit, but their position is we only have these two options, and so this is what we have to choose, or you can make the choice. But at this point, you as the evaluator don't have to make that choice. You can simply state neither one of those programs are appropriate. And you can suggest that the team consider deferring the program to CBST, to place the student in a state-approved private school. The CSE often, like we discussed, will argue or present the position that those programs are too restrictive. But as we discussed, there are many programs that, although they're self-contained classrooms, they provide small classes with similarly cognitive functioning peers and are appropriate in other ways, but most importantly, would provide the type of support the student needs. So at this point, you can continue to go back to the data, pointing to why each one of the program recommendations in the community school is not appropriate to really push for the recommendation of a CBST deferral. And although the CSE may agree, often it happens where a neuropsychologist makes the case and the CSE begrudgingly makes a deferral. But there are other times where they just will not agree and basically recommend the ICT class or whatever recommendation they make. But the benefit of having your presence at the meeting to appear telephonically but to make that case really is something that we can point to at a hearing, because the CSE's obligation is really to develop a consensus among the parent and the evaluators and the providers as to what the student requires. And it demonstrates they were not able to do that. And we can point to your report and your evaluations as to why the program recommendation they ultimately made was not appropriate. So even if they don't agree with you, you've had the success of making the case during the meeting. So Jennifer's going to discuss our other 2 points on this issue.
Okay, so we have some specific tips for you for right now with COVID happening. When you're in a meeting these days, you should ask about what the remote learning schedule is or program is. They most likely will tell you that it's up to the individual school, but I wouldn't take that as an answer. I would really push, because it can make a big difference in terms of how much is going to be hybrid, how many options there are for in-person, what level of consistency is there for the child, will the same teachers be teaching each day? These are the types of things that, I don't have to tell you are really important, and we'd be remiss if we didn't ask that. Again, they may not know, they may blow you off, but it's better, to have asked, and then at least we can note that you weren't given an adequate answer. You should also, and the parent should also request a remote learning plan. They really are supposed to be doing these, and I saw some that they did over the spring, and they were really not good. There's no other way to say it. Very minimal, and really didn't describe, the real specifics, what therapies will be in person, what therapies will be online, what will be pre-recorded, what will be live. These are all things that it's hard really to assess the appropriateness of the program for the child without knowing this. Now, of course, this is all subject to change, and we understand that, but you should have some sense at the meeting of this stuff, because otherwise it's hard to really make a recommendation. At the meeting, you should also make remote recommendations. So talk to the team about what the child will need on those remote days. And what types of supports they may need, even just to sit in front of the computer. We all know that's been a big issue, is just getting the kids to engage in the Zoom. That's been really hard. What would you recommend for this particular student? And what should the school be providing to get them on the Zoom? Because I know a lot of public schools have kind of thrown up their hands and said, well, we have no choice. It's a pandemic. We can't really do anything. But we all know that there are some tips and tricks and strategies that can be used to try to coax the child into participating remotely. And to that end, you can also recommend support and training for the parents, because they're the ones that are taking on this burden. And I don't just mean, teaching tips. I mean, the school should really be supporting them with trainings on how to, engage the child is a great example, or what they can be doing at home to help reinforce these issues, maybe make the child more comfortable. If the school is not properly supporting the parent such that it's then impacting the child because the parent doesn't know how to get the child to engage, that's problematic. So I think making recommendations to the best of your ability on how to help these families and what this child may need is really important. And the DOE needs to be including this in IEPs. I know they've avoided it, hoping that things would be better this year, as we all did. But we're in this for the long haul now, and this really needs to be included, because so many kids are really getting left behind. And finally, and this tip goes for COVID or not COVID, you can always tell the CSE or the CBST that you disagree with the recommendation. You have more leeway than the parent in doing that, because of their need to be cooperative. And you should, in fact, say that you disagree with the recommendation if you do. You don't have to shut the whole thing down, and you, of course, can be extremely respectful. But you can say respectfully, my professional opinion is this isn't going to work. And you can insist, they may or may not do it, but you can insist that they make note of your objections. And when you do that, I would talk specifically about what the problems are with the recommendation. Maybe, again, that the size is great, but the peer group just isn't going to work, or vice versa. So just remember that you can always disagree with the recommendation. So at this point, we're going to open it up for questions. If you go in the chat or the Q&A section, you can type your questions in there, and we're happy to answer them. And we'll be sticking around for a while to answer any questions you have, or if you have any anything you want to share about these situations, we'd be happy to hear about that. So we'll just give you a chance to do that, and then we can answer. Cynthia, did I miss anything?
No, I think you just want to make sure that the chat option is available. Here we go. I think we... All right. So it looks like it's late and everybody is probably tired. So I am guessing that if we don't have any questions at this point, we just wanted to review some takeaways. before we sign off. We just wanted to go over the takeaways from the seminar that, just to we really appreciate that you would take the time, in the evening to come and listen to this seminar, because we just know and appreciate and understand how critical your role is in securing services for students. Just to remind you, you're not limited by the DOE options, and that you can and should recommend what the student needs and requires versus, what the DOE is indicating are their limited possibilities. Also, if to really include recommendations for in-person and remote learning, given that this is going to be the current circumstances for a while. And then just a reminder to use descriptions and avoid DOE labels. So during this time and really in the future. So we will be sending the recording via email. Please feel free to share it for anyone who's would be interesting, and we'll have it on our websites as well. We've included here our contact information, so that if you have questions or have specific questions that you want to ask, please feel free to contact either one of us and reach out. We'd be happy to talk to you about these issues, and we're always very curious to hear what you're experiencing during this time. We're in it to support the students, and we know you are too. And so we really look forward to collaborating with you during this really difficult time and supporting parents. So,
yeah, sorry, I completely concur, and I'm here, for questions anytime. I'm happy to, bounce ideas off of. This is a tough time. We're all kind of figuring it out together. So it's better if we all work together on that. So you can contact me or Cynthia or both of us at any time. I think we do have one question right now, Cynthia, which is, do the teams seem to be more amenable to agreeing to New York State approved schools since COVID?
It's really tends to be, in my experience, it tends to be team to team. So there's some teams that are, and then there are others that it seems like they just traditionally are not. I get the impression that a lot of times the teams are trying to really conserve resources, and so they tend to be reluctant to make that recommendation. But in the last 2 months, I've had some significant success in having students defer to CBST. So when the need's there, they tend to be willing to do it.
I would agree with Cynthia. I think the times that I see them defer the CBST the most, pre and post COVID, have been when the child has been in the public school and it's not working, and they know it's not working, and they feel a connection to the parent and student, so they want the best for the child. I think that plays into it, but I think it's also just the idea that they just know it's not working. And that's where I tend to see most of my CBST deferrals, is when the child's been in the public school. But I think it is team to team, and unfortunately, I haven't necessarily seen them get much better since COVID. But, again, some of this COVID stuff has taken a while to kind of catch up. So let's see in the next, through the end of the year. It'll be interesting in the spring, when most of the IEP meetings happen, to see how all this is going to be impacted.
I see a question, friend.
We have another question, which is actually, go ahead. You can go, Cynthia.
Sure. Now I see a question from Kate Lawler indicating, is there still a case for
private? Want me to read it?
I think I can read it.
Yeah.
Is there still a case for private school placement if the student is doing fine pre-COVID and then fell apart during remote learning? I think that that's an argument. Certainly, you're recognizing the argument that the DOE would make, that this is just a temporary situation. But I think, at the IEP meeting, the question becomes, what does the student require right now? So if the student has decompensated significantly during this time, and I've seen some of that, the isolation that's involved in remote learning, the lack of communication with their peers and interaction. So some students I've seen have actually done well, but other students who, there's a difference between like kind of an anticipated, uh, a bit of anticipated slide or backsliding, but then there's some students who literally have really decompensated. So I think if they are at the stage where they now need a therapeutic day program or something along those lines, you're really looking at the student. What do they require right now and for the next year? So if it looks as though we're going to be in these circumstances for the end up until the end of the year, then I think the argument can be made that the student should be deferred and placed in a private program if their needs have increased so much that that's what they require.
I mean, I wouldn't say it's the majority, but it's actually probably the majority of my brand new cases are kids that fell apart in the spring, and parents are truly at their wits' end. And I think Cynthia's absolutely right. It has to do with this continuing into the future. And one of the arguments I plan to make in these cases is, one thing in March when we all had little to no warning that this was going to happen and everything was kind of thrown together. But we knew in September for a long time that this was going to be problematic. And if they didn't set up, say, a remote learning plan, or they didn't have those recommendations in place to help this child, that's problematic for the 2021 school year. Because there's no indication that this child would continue to do better this year if they fell apart in the spring. So, issues, this is all very new. So unfortunately, I can't say, there's not a lot of case law for me to point to. There's not a lot of examples. We are kind of in uncharted territory. But I am going to make the argument that, you didn't put the supports in place. Now, in some of these cases, the child has regressed so significantly that even if, say, we had completely opened up for this fall, this child would probably need more help than they would have needed last year, unfortunately, just even if we were completely, fully functioning again, because this child has regressed so much in the spring. So that's also another angle. But I think we're going to see this a lot for the coming year, and we're going to have to see how it plays out. But I think you do absolutely have a case, and a lot of those parents are coming to us.
I think also an issue that's coming up is that the Department of Education is going to be expecting, a bit of a pass on a lot of issues because of the difficulties they're experiencing. But, really it's like the squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's really, if we don't advocate for them, then who will? And the DOE will, we see the DOE struggling and we feel for those teachers, but, the student is not the one who is supposed to pay for the situation and struggle. It's, it's like we just feel like we have to do everything we can to eke out as many services as we can. And it can just be increased, speech services or OT and increases in those areas. It doesn't always have to be this pursuit of a private school. It can just be the student needs more, small group support sets, those requests can be made as well. And, I'm sure schools are reluctant to provide them. Their resources are stretched, but, it's like whatever can be provided. They're supposed to provide comp ed services if they can't provide it, RSAs, P4s, things like that. And so, there are options that can be provided during the summer or during breaks to really make up and to really try to stave off the regression and the backslide.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think they are going to make this argument. They are going to look for a pass. I mean, we just know it's coming. But also a lot of the private schools have been able to do it. And again, that's not to disparage the DOE teachers. Most of them are really working hard and just don't have the resources. But if these children are able, or especially a specific child, able to function really well with the supports that the private schools are putting in place around their remote programs, I think it has to be said, why weren't those supports put in place for this child in public school? I think that might be it.
I think that is. So, let's see here. All right. Well, let's see. Great. Well, thank you again for participating and taking the time to be part of this webinar.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for your kind words and comments in the chat. And let us know, again, how we can support you. Oh, I forgot to mention that we are going to do another one of these that's more geared towards people with school programs and COVID issues. Some of the same stuff, but this is, obviously more for evaluators, and we would, we want you to know that in the next few weeks we'll be doing one for schools. So send us your questions if you have any ahead of time, so that we can, make sure we get everything answered for you. But we also just hope you have a wonderful night, a wonderful weekend and Halloween as best you can. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.